Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Carrie Jones, and today we're going to do a webinar on putting the puzzle pieces together. We're going to cover phase 1, 2, and 3 estrogen detoxification. This subject is very near and dear to my heart. It's something that I really enjoy talking about, and I find that a lot of practitioners understand the basics of estrogen detoxification, but we get concerned because we give our patients estrogen. We get concerned about estrogen dominant type symptoms. We can get concerned about estrogen cancer risk, and so this is 90 slides that is going to hopefully put everything together for you and make it very actionable. So let's get started. So our objectives, first of all, we're going to talk about the different ways estrogen is cleared from the body by going through, of course, phase 1, 2, and 3 estrogen detox, focusing primarily on the liver. We will touch upon the genetics involved in 1, 2, and 3 detox. And then, of course, we're going to touch on the gut microbiome, specifically something that's called the Estrobolome, which is one of my most favorite words, the Estrobolome in the gut and how that affects phase 3 detox. And we'll be talking about treatment along the whole way. Okay, so let's set the scene. So you are a person, male or female, and you make an estrogen, or maybe you're female and you're taking an estrogen. You use that estrogen, you're done with that estrogen, and where does your estrogen go, right? We need to know, where does your estrogen go? So with estrogen detox, we're going to talk about phase 1 detoxification, specifically through, of course, hydroxylation. This is into the 2, the 4, and the 16 hydroxy pathways that many of us have heard about over and over. We're going to talk about phase 2 detoxification through methylation and how that involves COMT or COMT. And then we'll talk about phase 3 detoxification, which utilizes transporters. That gets the hormone from in the cell, out of the cell, and then it moves on into the kidney, and then, of course, the bile, and into the intestines. Speaking of the intestines, we're going to be looking at beta-glucuronidase. How do you test for beta-glucuronidase? What does beta-glucuronidase do? And why is it a problem? Why is it helpful? And what can we do about it? So let's start with the liver. So for those of you who have seen steroid pathways before, in this particular pathway, of course, is the pathway for precision analytical, or the Dutch test, and it's in the lower right-hand corner. So we're going to be focusing on right there, E1, E2, E3, the 2, 4, and 16, and the methoxy, which is moving through phase 2 detoxification. So why is estrogen metabolism important? Well, first and foremost, you have all these patients that come to you that are estrogen dominant. You have women that are experiencing PMS, breast tenderness, heavy periods, endometriosis, adenomyosis. They're concerned about things like PCOS, fertility, anything that's really got that like high luteal or luteal phase estrogen compared to their progesterone. You have men that are experiencing moodiness, erectile dysfunction, weight gain, breast development, all because of too much estrogen. And then number 2, we're concerned about estrogen-based cancer risk. So this is my Dr. Jones estrogen metabolism chart that is expanded. I call this my stick figure chart. I created this about a year ago to make it that much simpler for those of you who are newer to estrogen detoxification. And I have it color coded. So basically the green leads to smiley faces, which is where you want to go. And the red leads to frowny faces, which is where you don't want to go. So we're aiming for the green, trying to avoid the red. But if you do get stuck on the red pathway, I do have treatment options for that as well. So if you'll look on the upper left-hand corner, you'll have your E1 and your E2. And then along the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see that there are 3 pathways you can choose from, your 2, your 4, and your 16 hydroxy pathways. Now, if you keep going across the slide to the right, you will see that if you look at the bottom, your 2 hydroxy and your 4 hydroxy can continue to follow the green through COMT, and they become methylated, and that's your phase 2 estrogen detoxification. That gets excreted healthy, and you can see a smiley face. But if you go up one level from that and you look at the red pathway, you can see that 4-hydroxy goes along something called the quinone pathway, where it becomes a semiquinone and then a quinone, which leads to something called a depurinating adduct, and that increases the mutation or cancer risk, frowny face. So we want to avoid that. Now you will see along that red pathway, there are 2 stop gaps, which we're going to talk about. The first one is quinone reductase, and the second one is GST, which is glutathione sulfotransferase. But I just want to have this slide so you guys have a really clear, easy visual. Follow the green, look for the smiley faces, try not to be on the red, but if you're on the red, look for the green and avoid the frowny faces. All right, so a little bit about each metabolite. So I have written there, it's important to remember these phase 1 metabolites are considered free radicals when they're in their semiquinone and quinone state. So when the 2 and the 4 convert into semiquinones or quinones, if they cannot get out through phase 2, this is a real problem. And you'll see there that the 2-hydroxy, which of course is the phase 1 metabolite we're talking about, it's considered the safer metabolite because it does bind to estrogen receptors, but it doesn't bind with, like, it's not as tight. It doesn't bind with as much affinity as like the 4 or the 16-hydroxy. And while the 2-hydroxy can form, of course, the semiquinone and quinone states, they're what's considered a stable adduct, which is much, much, much safer when it comes to DNA mutation. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Interestingly enough, high levels of 2-OH can inhibit tyrosine hydroxylase, and that can lead to the potential of less dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. So this is a good reason that you want to help clear your estrogens all the way out of your body so that you don't affect your neurotransmitter production. Now on the right-hand side, you'll see 2-methoxy. So the methoxy, like I was saying, is part of phase 2. It's gone through methylation, which we're going to talk about. But the 2-methoxy is actually considered pretty good. In fact, really pretty good. It's considered anti-proliferative, and you can see there microtubule disruption, apoptosis induction, angiogenesis inhibition, which are all really good things when it comes to the risk for cancer. It is considered to have anti-aromatase activity. So for those men and women that have really high aromatase enzyme activity in their body, specifically, men, because men really get that aromatase kicked up there in that fat tissue, which can lead to excess estrogen that they don't need or want. So if you have really good methylation and you're really getting that 2-methoxy, the 2-hydroxy converted into 2-methoxy, then it is protective and helpful against aromatization. The 2-methoxy is not really thought to bind to the estrogen receptor. Some research I read said at all, and others said at substantially less affinity. In fact, one research article I read said 2,000 times less affinity than 2-hydroxy, and 2,000 times less affinities is pretty less. That's pretty little. But we like the methoxy phase for the 2, given all its anti-cancer benefits. But speaking of cancer, we move into the 4-OH. So the 4-OH is unfortunately the most carcinogenic because it forms the unstable or the depurinating adduct, which we will talk about. And it does bind to the estrogen receptor with very high and very tight affinity compared to the 2-hydroxy. And unfortunately, if you have a lot of estradiol floating around, it will increase the enzyme CYP1B1 that causes higher 4-OH. So you have to be careful for those. This is why detoxification is so important, is we want our cytochromes. We don't want the cytochrome 1B1 increased. We want that one in particular decreased. So that brings us into our 16. So estriol, believe it or not, many of you may not realize this, but estriol is not made in the ovaries. It is made primarily in the liver. So you get the 16-hydroxylation of estradiol. So estradiol, turns into estriol, or you get what's called the dehydrogenation of the 16-hydroxy-E1. So the other word for estriol is 16-hydroxy-E2, which can be very confusing. But when you're reading the research, 16-hydroxy-E2 is actually estriol. It's a very weak estrogen. However, estriol can bind to the estrogen receptor, but it is also quite weak, especially when you compare it to something like E1 or E2 or even the 4-OH. And we know that estriol generally tends to prefer the estrogen receptor beta, which is why it can be really helpful for things like vaginal lubrication, because you have a lot of estrogen receptor beta down in the vaginal area. And it's largely considered by some regard to be anti-cancer or supportive to helping prevent estrogen cancers. And one of the reasons it's an antagonist at high levels to the G protein coupled estrogen receptor 1. So it can help inhibit cancer cell growth, which is really helpful, obviously. Unfortunately, though, your 16-hydroxy-E1 binds extremely tightly to the estrogen receptor and can be almost as potent as estradiol. So if you have a lot of 16-hydroxy-E1 on testing and she's reporting a lot of estrogen dominant type symptoms, tender full breasts, heavy periods, clots, cysts, fibroids, endometriosis, adenomyosis. So 16-hydroxy-E1 is associated with proliferation. It makes things grow. So it can make breast or estrogen dominant or estrogen receptor cancers grow. It can make, breast tissue grow. It can make endometrial tissue grow if you're dominant here, which is another huge reason that we want to really focus on estrogen detoxification, because you're always going to have a little bit, but too much, and now you have all this proliferation. And interestingly, it's possibly upregulated by non-caffeine. So those of you who are soda drinkers, or those of you who do energy drinks or energy pills, please be very careful, as this might definitely upregulate your 16-hydroxy-E1 formation. So speaking of cancer, we have talked a lot about these things called adducts. Where does cancer come into play? So when we're looking at your E1 and E2 as they move through phase 1 detoxifications, we're looking at the cytochromes, right? We're looking at the 1A and the 1B. So we have the 1A1 and 1A2 that helps upregulate or promote or push the healthier 2 pathway. And then we have that 1B1, which you can see again is red, and I should have put a frowny face there, but that will upregulate your 4 pathway, which can be concerning. Now, how do these metabolites actually, quote unquote, cause breast cancer? Well, when they get into the semiquinone and then quinone state, they bind to the DNA and form what's called a depurinating adduct. And it's these depurinating adducts that are the real problem. And if you go back to my lovely stick figure chart, that's where we are, where that big red arrow is on the depurinating, where the depurinating adducts are on the red pathway leading to a frowny face. So if you get to the point where you're beyond the quinone form and forming adducts, you're really close to potential for mutation and subsequently cancer risk. So adducts come in 2 forms. They come as a stable adduct and an unstable or a depurinating adduct. What's the difference? Okay, stable adducts remain in your DNA unless they're removed by repair. So your stable adducts are like your nice, good, obedient children. The stable adducts are the children that you're like, hey, I need you to sit right here and don't move. I'll be back in just a second. And the child just sits there and waits for their parent to come back. And what happens is when you have stable adducts is that your DNA repair system comes in, sees that it's an adduct, and then it can do its job and repair it, and hopefully, of course, get it right, get the repair right. But with the stable adduct, when it waits in the DNA, it's waiting for the repair to happen, then you don't get holes. You don't get the unstable, which of course are depurinating, break off. You get less risk for mutation because they're waiting there patiently to get fixed properly. Now, this is different from your depurinating or your unstable adducts. Now, these are like your wild child that like completely just break off and run all over the house. Like they're in the family room and they run upstairs and you clean the family room and you follow them upstairs and now they've destroyed, their bedroom. And then you work on their bedroom and you come back downstairs and they've destroyed the family room that you've just cleaned. This is what a depurinating adduct does. It breaks out of the DNA, leaving all these holes that your DNA repair system has to clean up. And when it has to clean up 1 or 2 holes, as an example, not so much of a big deal. Your DNA repair system can probably get it right and keep up with it. But let's pretend you have a lot of DNA adducts that are breaking off. You have a lot of unstable adducts. Now your DNA repair system might get lazy, sloppy, overwhelmed. Think of it like a factory that's trying to produce a product way too fast. So the paint colors are wrong, the screws are missing, things are, put in the wrong place of whatever you're trying to build. It's the same thing in your DNA. Things have a very high risk of going wrong because the body doesn't like holes, so it will go to fix those first. But if you have an overwhelming amount of holes in your DNA, you get this risk of mutation. Now, what's interesting is particularly these unstable addicts, they break off at the N3 or the N7 of the adenine and the N7 of the guanine, but it's the adenine depurination that happens instantly, whereas the guanine is slower. So if you get an adduct formation at the N7 guanine, it can happen over hours. And in this study, the study was pointing out that if you can improve methylation, if you can improve phase 2 detoxification, then the guanine, the N7 guanine, actually doesn't break out. It stays in the DNA because it takes a couple hours for it to break out. But if you fix the methylation, then your amount of addicts that you form goes way down, takes the pressure off of your repair system, and now your repair system can properly repair where these holes are made. Now, the unstable, this is where your 4-hydroxy comes into play. Your 2-hydroxy, what I was saying earlier, those are your stable addicts. Those are your good children. They just stay in the DNA and they wait to get fixed. Your 4-hydroxy, these are your wild children. These are your depurinating addicts. They leave holes and damage wherever they go. So we're trying to affect these depurinating addicts. And for those of you who don't quite remember what I'm talking about when I say the repair mechanism, I have the sort of the step-by-step, very generalized basis, just as a reminder for you of how your DNA does get repaired. But if you look at the very bottom, there's two things. One, deletion mutations in any of the base excision repair mechanism can increase cancer risk, of course, and that's any cancer, not just estrogen-related cancers. But more importantly, your base excision repair mechanism worsens with age. It worsens with environmental chemicals. It worsens, of course, with radiation and chemo exposure. And believe it or not, low magnesium. Magnesium is a cofactor for one of these steps. So how many people do you know are exposed to environmental chemicals, environmental toxicants, whether they know it or they don't know it? So if we can affect our patients and really, educate them on what they put in their body and what kind of food they buy, what they use in their home and their makeup and their skincare and that, their hobbies and what they use in their yard, what they do at work. If we can really affect that, then we can really help their base excision repair mechanism. And then, of course, if we can get their magnesium up, that can be really helpful as well. And how many of your patients are low magnesium? Probably a lot of them. I mean, it's really common to be low magnesium. So for comparison, when it comes to breast cancer, though, I wanted to show you this study about DNA adducts. And you can see on the left-hand side, this is a study where they looked at 40 healthy women, no breast cancer, 40 women who have a high risk for breast cancer, and 40 women who actually have breast cancer. And they're addicts. They looked at the adduct formation. And you can see on the far left side, the healthy women in kind of that turquoise blue color, everyone has addicts. Like we talk about, we have cancer in us at all time. We always have addicts. We always have these potential, these holes. But look how minimal the healthy women have. And then look right in the middle, that darker blue, the women at high risk have a lot of addicts. And then compare that to the far right, the purple, the women with breast cancer. I mean, it almost looks the same. The adduct amount, the depurinating adduct amount between women at high risk and women with breast cancer is almost identical. And so it just goes to show that if we can minimize these addicts, then we can really, just one more step that we can help. Now, this is women, but men and women, to reduce their estrogen cancer risk. So when we get into phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification, this is always the analogy that I use. It's always a clawfoot bathtub, and it's clawfoot, of course, and it's a pretty one because, well, I'm a girly girl, so I want a clawfoot bathtub. But imagine the water coming into your phase 1 bathtub is your phase 1 metabolites. So what kind of water is filling up your bathtub? Is it the right type of water? Is your water coming in fast? Is your water coming in slow? So basically, do you have 2 water? Do you have 4 water? Do you have 16 water that's dominating? Is that water coming in too fast? If it's 4 water and it's coming in fast, then we have to do something very quickly. Or is it coming in very slow? Do you have a slow phase 1 detoxification, and we actually need to speed it up? We need to help you get from out in circulation into the liver and through phase 1. Now, once you're in the bathtub, we have to get rid of it, right? So that's phase 2. That's the ability of your drain. How open is your drain? How closed is your drain? Do you have so much water coming into your drain that your drain is open but not open wide enough? And so it's more of a ratio or relative ratio from the water coming in to how open and unclogged your drain is. So this is what we're going to talk about as we talk about what we can do about phase 1 and phase 2. So let's start with phase 1, of course. So these are your cytochrome, the 1 family, 1A1, 1A2. And of course, they're affected by iron. CYP are heme dependent. And how many of your patients have iron issues? Either iron overload or they're iron anemic or, iron insufficient. So many of your patients. So if they already have iron issues, they're probably going to, in part, have some detoxification issues. Environmental toxicants. We know that environmental chemicals affects your base excision repair mechanism, but it will also affect your CYPs, of course. Smoking, charred meat from barbecues, and grapefruit juice will all affect your CYP family. So just keep this in mind first and foremost. Now, here's an example of somebody going through phase 1, and it doesn't matter if it's male or female, but what you can see across the top is this person's E1 and E2 are in the red. So when we look at these results, the results are red like a gas gauge. So there's the 2 stars, and the stars are your upper and lower limits, and then the dial. So the dial has an arrow on it, and it goes up or goes down. And in the E1 and the E2 are high in the red. So there's too much estrogen, too much E1, and too much E2 floating around. So this person probably has a lot of estrogen dominant type symptoms. Female, she probably has PMS, breast tenderness, heavy periods, moodiness, maybe adenomyosis, endometriosis, fibroid formation. Men, they get the belly fat, right? The breast development, moodiness as well, erectile dysfunction. But then as it goes to go through phase 1 detoxification, I have the frowny face there. I mean, this person is very clearly on the red pathway. Their 4-OH-E1, their 4-hydroxy is in the red. So they are very quickly going down that 4 pathway. Now, I have it in the yellow, which is sort of more of a neutral. You'll see the 16-OH-E1 or 16-hydroxy. It's at the upper end. 3.5 is the cutoff, and this person is at 3. So they really are preferring the bad naughty pathway, that 4 pathway. Their risk for adduct formation might be higher, and their proliferation, especially if it's female, is probably a real problem. So they're kind of doubly estrogen dominant. Their E1 and E2 is high, their 16 is high, their 4 is high, and I mean, this is just a reactive oxygen species mess, isn't it? I mean, their poor DNA. This particular example, they were given DIM or diindol methane, and in just 2 weeks, diindol methane dropped everything back down into a much better range. So you can see their E1 and E2 dropped back into the green. You can see their 4 and their 16 dropped away from the star, so back into the green. And in fact, their 2-OH, which of course is the healthier pathway we prefer, now it's a smiley face, so it's much better. So in just 2 weeks, diindol methane made a significant improvement. So let's talk about diindol methane and where it comes from, indole 3-carbinol or I3C. So if you have somebody that has a phase 1 problem, we're just talking about phase 1, a phase 1 problem, you're going to consider diindol methane or indole 3-carbinol. So the problem though with indole 3-carbinol is that it needs stomach acid to convert into a lot of things, one of which is DIM or diindol methane. So if you have a patient with very poor stomach acid, or they're on acid blockers or proton pump inhibitors, then indole 3-carbinol may not be the right supplement for them. You may need to go ahead and give them DIM or diindol methane. And you can see there the range is huge, depending, of course, on their stomach acid. 10 to 60% of indole 3-carbinol converts to DIM, 10 to 60%. And so you may have to help them with their stomach acid with either enzymes or HCl or apple cider vinegar or, lemon water to try to improve bitters, bitter herbs to try to get their stomach acid improved. Now, it comes from the brassica family, right? Your broccoli, your kale, your cauliflower, what have you. And the DIM in the food increases if you chop the food and leave it there for a couple minutes, or if you mildly heat it. So mildly steam it, mildly stir fry it and cook it. And DIM itself is out of the body within about 24 hours. So the half-life is within hours, and research shows that, really by the next day, if your DIM is pretty much gone. So if you're trying to use DIM as a treatment, this is something you would do every day, as opposed to for those people who forget their supplements and say, oh, I take it 3 times a week when I remember. Probably it's helpful, but DIM is one you're going to want to take every day. But the way DIM works is that it increases the conversion of your E1 and E2 in circulation down the 2-OH pathway through CYP1A, which is good. We want to favor this healthier 2 pathway. That's what we're going for. Now, what we do see DIM do is it will pull the E1 and E2 out of circulation. So if you have an estrogen dominant person, this is a good thing. But if you have somebody who's low estrogen, let's say she's menopausal, then it might make her symptoms, her estrogen deficiency symptoms, worse. So you may not want to consider DIM for her if she's menopausal. You may want to consider everything else we're going to talk about instead. Now, DIM also increases NRF2, and we're going to talk about NRF2 when we get into another treatment option, which is called sulforaphane, as NRF2 is really helpful for upregulating phase 2 enzymes to try to, of course, clear it out of the body. Research shows the average dose is 100 to 300 milligrams a day. And you can see I have a PubMed ID listed there. It's an incredibly wonderful, all-encompassing article around DIM. So if you're new to DIM or not sure about DIM, or you don't believe me, you are welcome to read that article, and it gives you everything. DIM does a whole lot more than just on this slide, but this is just a little snapshot into DIM. People will then say, well, I prefer to be food-based. I'm just going to tell my patients to eat brassica family foods, which I highly encourage, absolutely 100%. But in this article, which I have listed there, you can see I have it highlighted. It is suggested that intake would need to be upwards of 600 grams a day and sustained for several years to achieve an anti-cancer benefit. So this is what happens. People will say, I don't understand why my estrogen detoxification doesn't look good. I eat broccoli every day, or I eat broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, what have you, every day. Why is my estrogen detox not better? And according to this article, you need to eat a lot of it, and you have to do it every day for years to really get that benefit. So for definitely some of our patients where a treatment intervention is needed, have them continue their cruciferous vegetables, but also consider adding in indole 3-carbinol, but work on their acid, or using diindolylmethane. All right, the Apiaceae family, continuing to work on phase 1. What is the Apiaceae family? That's your carrot, your cumin, your dill, your fennel, your anise, your celery, what have you. And you can see I have some studies listed there on how it's been pretty effective for detoxification through your CYP and, of course, through your liver. So caraway, anise, and celery inhibited CYP1B1 to reduce 4-OH. So using those things in your cooking can, if you're continuing to go for food-based, do it, absolutely. Aqueous extracts of fennel, cumin, parsley, anise, I don't even know what that is, but I do know angelica, carrot seeds, celery, caraway, coriander, and dill. I mean, that's a lot. That's almost the whole family. Inhibited oxidative adduct formation. That's pretty impressive. So using carrot seeds, using celery, using caraway, fennel, cumin, parsley in your cooking every day can really go a long way as you add it to your brassica family, and of course, if you need to take I3C or DIM. Now, cilantro is often used for its general liver supportive properties, and of course, it can mildly chelate lead and mercury, which is not the point of this talk, but I thought, of course, it's pretty interesting. There's the research there. And then raw unpeeled carrots. So if you buy carrots, don't peel them, wash them, but don't peel them. And the carrots contain high amounts of indigestible fiber, which is really good for your gut microbiome. And that'll be really good as we get into the GI slides. What about coffee? I get asked about coffee a lot in liver and estrogen. And I found this article so fascinating. Coffee, not other caffeines, not like tea or soda or, energy drinks, but coffee itself with caffeine, not decaf, actual coffee, Raised, look at that, I have it highlighted, raises your 2-hydroxyestrone and 2-hydroxyestradiol. So these are they're called catechols, so your 2-catechol category. So coffee helps to improve your phase 1 detoxification and push it more down that healthier 2 pathway. Now, it doesn't help your phase 2 pathway. It just helps your phase 1 moving your 2 pathway. So for those of you who are coffee drinkers, you can rejoice, and you can see across the top the cups a week, less than 6 cups a week, all the way up to 4+ cups a day. Now, we know, obviously, that coffee can have other potentially negative things as well, such as on your cortisol. And you have to be careful with your coffee just because of, mold and fungus and stuff, and sprayed, and, the kind of coffee you're getting, and making sure it's not, full of chemicals. Like, definitely be very cautious and smart about your coffee. But for those of you who are healthy coffee drinkers, rejoice, you are helping your 2 OH pathway, which is the pathway we want to help. All right, leptin. What is leptin? So this is a really interesting quote. Increased levels of estrogens caused by aromatization of adipose tissues, inflammatory cytokines such as TNF-alpha, interleukin-6, and prostaglandin E2, insulin resistance and hyperactivation of insulin-like growth factor pathways, adipokines, and oxidative stress. I mean, like, that's every single bad thing in the body, right? Like, that's everything we talk about with inflammation, are all aberrantly regulated in obese women, as these undoubtedly contribute to carcinogenesis. So what is the point of this? The point is, as if you have all this extra fat tissue, then you're going to have elevated leptin plus all these inflammatory markers, insulin resistance, and all of these things contribute to a path of potential carcinogenesis. So what the study was saying is, if you, in particular, they were looking at women, but with men as well, leptin is a hormone that's released from your fat tissue, and it's a satiety hormone. It helps you decide if you're full or not, based on your intake. And it comes out of your fat tissue and it goes to your hypothalamus. It crosses the blood-brain barrier and goes to your hypothalamus. If you have high leptin, then it means the hypothalamus is not listening, or the hypothalamus cannot hear it. The leptin is not able to cross the blood-brain barrier and get to your hypothalamus. So if you have high leptin, it's called leptin resistance, similar to insulin resistance, and you get increased inflammatory cytokines in the adipose tissue. So the higher the leptin, you get this resistance and an increased risk of inflammatory cytokines. Well, that's not good. And then with high leptin and all this inflammation, you get increased aromatization, because a big thing that increases aromatization is inflammation. So now you have more conversion of testosterone into estrogen. So now you're more estrogen dominant. So high leptin will also increase your 4 pathway and increases your risk of depurinating adduct formation. And we just talked about how bad that is. High leptin will increase your CYP1B1, so now you have higher 4-OH in general, and that's why you have higher adduct formation. It downregulates your quinone reductase. That's not good. If you go back to my stick figure chart, but we will talk about this. This is one of your stop gaps to keep you off the frowny face pathway and put you on a smiley face pathway. And high leptin reduces COMT, or COMT. This is not good either, is now you can't methylate your estrogen out of your body, and you get more 4-OH and more adduct formation. So the point of this is we need to really address leptin when it comes to estrogen detoxification. So for those of you who aren't testing leptin, it's a blood test, and you do it fasting in the morning. The ranges for most standard labs is usually up to about 30. And the research I have read about sort of optimizing the optimal leptin levels, I used to think it was below 15 was my goal. And I forget the lower end of the range. And another research article I read talked about leptin and its effect on blocking T4 to T3 conversion. So in thyroid, higher leptin blocks T4 to T3. And so that author of that article suggested a fasting leptin be under 10, which I should have listed here and forgot. But for those of you who are new to leptin, start checking fasting leptin levels. But how do you address leptin? What do you do? So it's a hormone out of your fat tissue crossing to your hypothalamus. Quality sleep, believe it or not, is super important. Proper breathing, so make sure you're addressing people who have sleep apnea. They report they're snoring at night, or their partners are telling them they're snoring. Oxygenation is important for this communication. Regular exercise, especially high intensity training and weightlifting, Intermittent fasting and the fasting mimicking diets have been shown to help lower leptin. High fructose, high sucrose diets have been shown to increase leptin, so definitely dietary counseling with your patients, lowering or avoiding or minimizing fructose and sucrose. Triglycerides, of course. In this study, they were saying how the high triglycerides levels blocks leptin from crossing into the blood-brain barrier to talk to the hypothalamus. So working on reducing their triglycerides. And then a couple of supplementation supports per the literature. So curcumin, obviously, don't you feel like curcumin just fixes everything allegedly? So curcumin is one of those. Of course, it's also very anti-inflammatory, which is very helpful. Zinc levels is zinc deficiency might be correlated with leptin resistance. Alpha lipoic acid, this study did one on 100 milligrams a day. Acupuncture. In this study, they looked at particular acupuncture points and how it helped to address leptin. And then metformin, which of course is glucophage, but they added metformin with 120 milligrams of ginkgo. Believe it or not, had significant improvement in addressing leptin levels over metformin by itself. And so it's something to consider, maybe adding in 120 milligrams of ginkgo with your metformin patients. And then chitosan. So chitosan is another, it's from shellfish, and so you have to be careful of those patients who are allergic to shellfish. But giving this was shown to help reduce leptin as well. Now, please keep in mind, you can give all the supplements in the world, but if your patients aren't addressing the cause of their obesity, if they're not addressing, their lifestyle and diet and habits and sleep and breathing, then it's, they're going to be on supplements forever. You have to address the cause as well, and still looking bigger picture, looking at thyroid and cortisol and everything else, insulin, adiponectin, all those things. But here are just some, supplements per the research to help you get going and maybe to try out with your patients. So melatonin and leptin, I love this quote. It's probably my second most favorite quote ever. But what it says is one of the main actions of melatonin is to participate in the circadian organization of metabolic functions and their association to circadian behavioral cycles, regulating food intake and energy expenditure. Moreover, melatonin drives the daily rhythmicity of plasma leptin and modulates the glycemic homeostasis according to the photoperiod-dependent metabolic state. It's essential for coupling metabolic functions to the light-dark cycle, ensuring metabolic homeostasis. Uncoupling of these functions is related to metabolic syndrome and obesity. Is that not like the prettiest quote ever? I don't know who wrote that. Well, obviously the authors there wrote that, but man, they must have been English grads as well. So basically what this is saying is if you have screwed up like dark, if you are on your phones at night, if you work night shift, if you were, staying up too late and you shouldn't, if you're not getting bright full spectrum light exposure in the morning, you get an uncoupling of these functions, as they put it so eloquently, increasing your risk for metabolic syndrome and obesity. I mean, the amount of research on circadian rhythm and health is what led to, of course, a lot of the researchers to win the Nobel Prize last year. And so please, please, please take sleep seriously. Get your light dark figured out. Get your circadian rhythm figured out. This is about leptin, but of course, it does so many other wonderful things. So what else can you do? We go back to this chart. We look at quinone reductase. We look at glutathione sulfur transferase. So glutathione sulfur transferase, we're looking at things that help with glutathione. So we're going to look at N-acetylcysteine. So N-acetylcysteine helps prevent DNA damage by reducing the semiquinone back into the fore, back to the beginning again. So this is like this. My analogy is always the same. So when you tell your child, like, hey kid, I want you to put on your jacket and go out the front door and get in the car because we're about to leave. And what does your child do? Your child goes the opposite way and, runs into the kitchen to go get themselves a snack. So N-acetylcysteine is what grabs the kid who's running back to the kitchen and pushes it out the front door. So it takes the child that's headed the opposite direction of what you just said, like a quinone about to become an adduct, and reroutes it back to where it's supposed to be, which is out the front door and into the car. So that's what's great about NAC. It helps reroute that quinone and prevent adduct formation. And you can see it inhibits adduct formation by 60% or more by reacting with the quinone itself. Of course, that's through glutathione, the glutathione sulfur transferase. And we know that hydrolysis of NAC, of course, with cysteine makes glutathione, and glutathione is our super potent antioxidant in our body. So in this study, they said the last two sentences. It says the depurinating adducts, the two different 4 adducts, the adenine and the guanine, they were reduced 46 and 37% respectively, with half the amount of N-acetylcysteine. And when they did a 1-to-1 N-acetylcysteine to the 4-hydroxy, then the levels of adducts were reduced to 86 and 85% respectively, which goes to show that even a little bit of N-acetylcysteine makes a difference. It can really help minimize your adduct formation. And they put this into this great graphical, which I have very technical there. You can see no NAC and the amount of adducts they have formed. It's a very high bar, and lots of NAC. Obviously, lots of NAC is the technical term for the ratio being 1-to-1, and the adduct formation drops really quite low. So N-acetylcysteine can be really helpful for those estrogen dominant, and especially when you're concerned about cancer risk. Which people say, well, can't I just give straight glutathione? Can I do, glutathione's very popular, liposomal glutathione is very popular. And I'm like, yep, absolutely. I love glutathione. I take liposomal glutathione when I need it. Just please be aware, make sure you can recycle it, understand how glutathione works in the body. And you can see I have all the cofactors listed there that are important, and magnesium, again, being one of them. And then know that, glutathione helps recycle other antioxidants, vitamin C, vitamin E, alpha lipoic acid, and CoQ10. And so if you are struggling with glutathione, definitely make sure your other antioxidants are high as well. Either, making sure you're eating foods high in those antioxidants, or consider doing extra antioxidants to help recycle glutathione, and then glutathione in turn helps recycle them, is part of a big process. So sure, you can give glutathione, that's fine. But what else can you do? So we've talked about we talked about DIM, indole-3-carbinol. We've talked about N-acetylcysteine and glutathione. Now we've got to sulforaphane. So sulforaphane is in cruciferous vegetables as well. And these vegetables have glucoraphanin in it. And when glucoraphanin meets the enzyme myrosinase, it turns into sulforaphane. And sulforaphane is what does the action. Now, broccoli sprouts have the highest concentration, followed by cauliflower and then mustard sprouts. And now, broccoli sprouts are fairly popular to grow. I know a number of people who grow them themselves, put it in their smoothies, or buy them at the store. I do not possess the green thumb. I cannot grow much anything other than like cactus succulents, and even then, I've been known to kill a succulent. But the good thing is there are lots of companies that have broccoli sprouts as a powder that guarantees the amount of sulforaphane in them, or you can take sulforaphane itself. So once absorbed, what does sulforaphane do? It does 2 big things. It affects glutathione through GST, which is very important, and it activates your nerve pathways, your NRF2 pathways, which helps induce your phase 2 enzymes, which we need, right? We need your phase 2 detoxification to neutralize and then get stuff out of the body. It also activates quinone reductase. So remember, quinone reductase is one of those ones that helps take the child that's supposed to be going out to the car, and when it runs the other way, then sulforaphane helps put it out the front door to the car again. So much like N-acetylcysteine, it takes that wild child headed the wrong direction and puts it right on the right path again. So again, sulforaphane is great for estrogen dominant folks because it helps reroute the red, the frowny face pathways back into the green pathway, back into the smiley face, and helps induce phase 2 enzymes, which we like. And for those of you who aren't that familiar with NRF2, or if this is the first time you've heard about it, it's a really important part of the body for combating oxidative stress and degenerative disease. And so I have a couple, points there on it that you're welcome to read. But really, the big thing that I like that it does is it induces phase 2 enzymes, because I'm trying to get those hydroxys to methoxys, because as I said way in the beginning, that 2-methoxy is actually protective. It's anti-cancer, and in fact, it's really protective and helpful in cardiovascular disease as well. But that's not the point of this lecture, but I wanted to just mention that really quickly. All right, resveratrol. What does resveratrol do? Well, it's kind of phase 1-ish, 2 and 3 metabolism. It's highest in Cabernet Franc wine, apparently, and which helps increase quinone reductase. So again, much like N-acetylcysteine can, much like sulforaphane can, Resveratrol can take your wild child headed down the wrong direction and point them back into the right direction. It is a non-competitive inhibitor of CYP1B1, so it can help lower your 4-OH formation, which is good. That will help lower your adduct formation. And again, it also induces NRF2. Unfortunately, it's not very bioavailable. As many of you know, it's very difficult to absorb, and so it's hard to get through supplementation or diet, food, wine, what have you. But resveratrol is used in a number of supplements, and you can see from this graphical here that in order to activate NRF2, sulforaphane is on the left side, and it requires a teeny tiny amount, just a little teeny tiny amount will activate NRF2, whereas it requires a whole lot of resveratrol to get that domino to fall. I'm not saying resveratrol is bad at all or to avoid it. If it's in your supplements, fine. If you happen to have a glass of Cabernet Franc tonight while you're listening to this webinar, then you're helping to activate NRF2. It's just not as potent and it is if you are listening to this webinar having broccoli sprouts in your smoothie or in your salad. So keep that in mind. Dose is very important. So what about phase 2 detoxification? Okay, so phase 2 detoxification requires COMT. It's the ability to get from your hydroxy to your methoxy, and it's that COMT. Now, everyone thinks it's MTHFR, and MTHFR is very important, but you can see in this sample result of this person, they are plus in two out of the three of their comps, which means it's slow. Plus is slow. So they have a 3 to 4 decreased COMT activity. And remember, my analogy is the bathtub. So even though the COMT might be working, is it working fast enough, wide enough, open enough, unclogged enough compared to the amount of water coming in? This person has a lot of water coming in. And then while their 2-methoxy is in between the stars, it's in the green, it's a drain that's not open wide enough. We need the drain to be open much wider, which is why on the left-hand side where it says methylation activity, it's leaning to low. So the drain is open. Absolutely. COMT is working somewhat. It's just not working fast enough for the amount of water that's coming in, the amount of hydroxy. So when it comes to COMT, this study, again, pointing back to Adducts, so when they gave, they used a COMT inhibitor to block the methylation, the amount of depurinating Adducts went up exponentially. And so again, right, if you can't get it out, then it has to go down a different pathway, and it will choose the red or the frowny face pathway, which we don't want to see. We want that COMT upregulated. And I was saying earlier, what is methylation? And so I have a quote here from Wikipedia. Don't judge me. I know it's from Wikipedia, but I really like what it says. So in the chemical sciences, methylation denotes the addition of a methyl group on a substrate or the substitution of an atom or group by a methyl group. So in biological systems, methylation is catalyzed by enzymes. Such methylation can be involved in modification of heavy metals, regulation of gene expression, regulation of protein function, and RNA processing. So basically, again, right, it's the addition of a methyl group. And so we talk a lot about MTHFR, methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, and the active methylation. They're different. The active methylation is getting the methyl group, and when we're talking about estrogen, we're talking about COMT. Now, MTHFR is important. It's an important part of that whole cycle that goes round and round. But ultimately, with estrogen, pay attention to your COMT results a little bit more. So COMT does require methyl donors, which are the two big cofactors are magnesium and SAMe. And so many people will, again, there's that magnesium again, right? It helps the DNA repair mechanism, and it helps, well, magnesium helps so many things, don't get me wrong, but here it helps COMT. And so if your patient is magnesium deficient, maybe adding in magnesium foods, having them take Epsom salt baths to get the magnesium, and then SAMe, which is the other cofactor for COMT. But you have to be careful with methyl donors because sometimes people get more anxious or more sort of jittery with methyl donors. But I have trimethylglycine, methionine, choline, your methylated B vitamins like your methyl B6, which is P5P, your methyl B12, your methylfolate. Those are all helpful when it comes to COMT and with phase 2 detoxification. Now, there's other things you can do. What slows down or affects COMT? Well, lots of stuff. Like I said, if you're a plus person, then you're going to have a slow COMT. If you're already estrogen dominant, it's not fair, but it will slow down COMT. If you have gut infections, then it will slow down COMT. So make sure you've got your gut figured out. Make sure you're doing stool testing and seeing what's going on there. Certain phenols from foods and supplements like green tea and quercetin can slow COMT down. It is dose dependent. Don't freak out if you think, oh, I drink green tea every day. Yes, but again, do you know what your COMT is? Are you a COMT plus person? What does your estrogen look like? This is why testing is so important, because if you don't have an issue with estrogen detoxification, then your daily green tea is not affecting you. High levels of SAW. So SAM is of course one of the cofactors for COMT. SAM goes out, donates its its methyl group, and comes back as SAW. And if SAW is too high, it will block all the methyltransferases. So some people are doing the SAM-SAW ratio to see what's going on. Chemicals, the bisphenols, so BPA, BPB, and all the other BPs they're not telling us about, and PCB exposure has been shown to slow down COMT. Serotonin, interestingly enough, high levels of serotonin can block SAM receptors in COMT. So this article talked about SSRIs and how people on SSRIs might potentially need to do low doses of SAM. So because serotonin might need to do low doses of SAM so that SAM can then like sort of push serotonin out of the way and bind to COMT so that COMT can do its thing, which I found really interesting because they specifically were looking at SSRIs, people on SSRIs. COMT inhibitors, of course, and then really anything that affects the methionine cycle. So that's that homocysteine to methionine and back around again. That's where you make SAM. That's where it's so important. So why is phase 2 detoxification important? Well, it's important because it takes those phase 1 metabolites that are harmful reactive oxygen species and makes them water soluble to be excreted. So the phase 1, it gets the ball rolling, right? Gets the water in the bathtub, and your phase 2 is what neutralizes it. It's the drain that then sweeps it out of the body or out of the house of your clawfoot bathtub so you can properly excrete it. So how do you properly excrete it? Well, now we move into phase 3 detoxification of estrogen. So what is phase 3 detox? So if you think about it, once you're an estrogen and you're water soluble, right? You've been methylated. So now you're a water soluble estrogen and you're sitting inside a cell. The problem is your cell membranes are lipophilic, right? I mean, this is why fat and oils are so important for the fluidity of your cell membranes. So if you're lipo or hydrophilic, you're water soluble, and you're sitting in a cell that's surrounded by a lipophilic membrane, how do you get out? How do you go from inside the cell to outside the cell, right? We got this, like now you're stuck, but you're not stuck. The body is smart and has put in transporters. And so phase 3 transporters are known as ATP binding cassettes, or ABC. The big one that you're going to see in the research, if you go look this up, is P-glycoprotein, or multi-drug resistant protein 1. And they move things from in the cell to out of the cell. And they move lots of things: drugs and medications, chemicals, intoxicants, hormones. They are a transporter for lots of stuff. So think of them as like your little taxi or your shuttle or your train or your tram that is moving you from one place across the road, across the way, across the city to the other place. And once they are out of the cell, they're in the interstitial fluid, and now they can be moved into your kidney and you can urinate it out, or into your bile and through your intestines, and you can have a bowel movement. And know that there are transporters at your blood-brain barrier too. So you have these transporters, of course, all over. I mean, their job is to get you from in the cell to out of the cell so your body can properly excrete them. So what slows down your transporters? Inflammation is the primary number one thing. Any and all inflammation affects your transporters. And the longer you've been inflamed, then the more of a problem this can be. So I see this a lot in people who are working on detoxification, and they'll say, they might get worse initially until they can get their inflammation dealt with. And oftentimes I suspect one of the reasons is that they can't get their water soluble junk from in the cell to out of the cell because the inflammation hasn't been fully dealt with, and they're their ability to get from in the cell to out of the cell has slowed way down. And so they're having a reaction when you're trying to speed up phase 1 and phase 2, and you don't speed up these transporters along with it. So you got to make sure these transporters are healthy. Oxidative stress will slow it down, of course. Being overburdened with toxicity. Specific medications slow the transporters down more than others, which I have listed there. You can see zithromycin, clarithromycin, proton pump inhibitors. How many of your patients are on proton pump inhibitors? Probably a lot. And quercetin. I know we use quercetin for a lot of things. In particular, it's used a lot with allergy stuff. But quercetin, and unfortunately, I can't find like a dose or a length of time. Not a lot of study. A lot of study has gone into quercetin. Not a lot of study has gone into quercetin and transporters. So I can't tell you, like if it's allergy season and you're taking 500 milligrams or 1,000 milligrams of quercetin, you know, what's it going to do to your detox? I don't know. Although I was lecturing at a conference once very recently, and I said this about quercetin, and one of the attendees came up and she said, you know, I noticed when I take, she said, I didn't know this correlation, but when I take quercetin at allergy season, she goes, I absolutely feel like much more estrogen dominant. I feel more toxic. she goes, and I never put the correlation together until you said that. And so she said, I have stopped taking quercetin as a result. So that was an N of 1, but I thought that was really interesting. So what can you do to support your transporters? Obviously, doing everything and anything to reduce inflammation, oxidative stress, and toxicity, and help support NRF2, which we've been talking about NRF2. So there's your sulforaphane, your curcumin or turmeric, berberine, resveratrol, the catechins in chocolate. Of course, the darker the better. I think dark chocolate is medicinal. Green tea, DIM, which we talked about initially, and not quercetin. Sorry. Now, quercetin is good for lots of other things, like I said, but we be careful with the transporters. Cell membrane support, so choline, healthy fats, healthy oils, things that support bile. Why? Because this transporter is trying to get from in to out through the cell membrane, and if it's stiff and rigid, then it's going to have problems. And then, of course, if you have bile issues, once it's out in the bile, then how are you going to, like, what are you going to do with it, right? Like, then it's potentially going to get reabsorbed. So for those of you who need a little reminder about bile, so we have, you know, B5 is important for bile. I just sort of have the steps of how bile is made, like lecithin, how it helps reduce gallstone formation. But just as a little reminder of, like, you know, what the steps it takes to make bile, you know, using, like I said, B5, cholesterol, glycine, taurine. So there's a lot that goes into bile. So make sure your patient's bile is healthy so that they can then take all this toxicity and properly excrete it. So what about overall dietary considerations? Obviously, hydration is key. The brassica family, the foods we talked about, artichoke, leafy greens, beets, onions, garlic, foods high in fiber like ground flax seeds, fermented foods, your colorful foods, your Apiaceae family using the spice turmeric. And then, of course, for bile, your eggs, your sunflower, lecithin, cold water fish, beef liver, and dark meat. And so there's a lot we can do dietarily as well, working with our patients' diets. So now that's out in the bile, right? Now we've got our estrogen out. We've crossed from inside the cell to outside the cell, and now we have to go through the gut microbiome. And that leads us to the estrobolome. The estrobolome is this aggregate of enteric bacterial genes, and they are capable of metabolizing estrogens. And they're highly affected, just like everything else in our microbiome is, highly affected by antibiotics, drugs, diet, everything, you know, that we think modulates its activity. So they did this study when they were looking at women, and they injected them with radio-labeled estrone, estradiol, and estriol. God bless them for signing up for this study, but they injected them with this radio-labeled estrogens, and they found they were expecting most of the estrogen would come out the other end. And it turns out 10 to 15% of the estradiol, estrone, and estriol were found in the feces, and most of it had been reabsorbed in circulation. This stumped the researchers, and they realized it was beta-glucuronidase, the enzyme in the gut that was causing this recirculation. So lots of bacteria can make the enzyme beta-glucuronidase. And so the Human Microbiome Project suspects there's about 50 plus species that encode for it, the enzyme. And you can see right there, you can see that many of the researchers decided to name themselves after bacteria. So if you were Colin or Edward or Allie or Rose or Tanner or Marvin, you just named yourself after a bacteria that codes for beta-glucuronidase. But you'll see on the next line down, there are several bacteria that many of you are familiar with: Bacteroides, Bifido, E. coli, Lacto, Faecobacterium. You know, so there's lots that we're familiar with that make the enzyme beta-glucuronidase. So don't think that beta-glucuronidase is all bad. It's not all bad. It helps us break down large carbohydrates. It helps us to reabsorb our flavonoids, and it assists with bilirubin reabsorption. So we need some beta-glucuronidase. That's why so many of the gut bacteria we're familiar with can make it. The problem is when it gets too much. So what happens is it deconjugates things. That's what it's known for. So it's great for bilirubin, maybe bad for estrogen. So if you think about it, the body puts estrogen in a box, ties it up with a bow to be excreted in the stool. So in this particular instance, we're talking about the act of glucuronidation. So not methylation, but glucuronidation. So different detox pathway. So glucuronidation, estrogen's in a box with a bow tied on, and what beta-glucuronidase does is it unties the bow, opens the lid, and it allows estrogen to escape and get reabsorbed. And so that's what it does. It's a gift opener when it's not supposed to be. It unties that bow. And there's a lot of research about the microbiome and the implications on our health at large. And here in particular, beta-glucuronidase deconjugates estrogen, and what happens is when you have excess estrogen, as we all know, it affects obesity, metabolic syndrome, cancer, endometrial hyperplasia, endometriosis, PCOS, fertility, cardiovascular disease, and cognitive function. So this study is really showing that just by having this excess of beta-glucuronidase can really affect estrogen, which then affects everything systemically. And as we're talking about estrogen-based cancers, like, did you know the breast has its own microbiome? And it's true. There's some articles talking about the microbiota of the breast tissue itself, the breast microbiome, a role for probiotics in breast cancer and breast prevention. So while you're affecting the microbiome in your intestinal tract, you can also affect the microbiome in your breast tissue. And a very cool clinical pearl that came out of the next research article is Lactobacillus acidophilus can actually reach the mammary gland. Like, how friggin' cool is that, right? You take Lactobacillus thinking it's all for your gut, and in fact, the mammary gland, it'll affect its microbiome as well. So in this article, the microbiome of aseptically collected human breast tissue in benign and malignant disease, the authors concluded the gut microbiome influences estrogen metabolism via the enterohepatic recirculation, of course, through beta-glucuronidase as the enzyme at large. Now, what's not commonly tested in stool testing, though, because you can test beta-glucuronidase in very, in functional stool testing companies, but there's other things like steroid sulfatase. So steroid sulfatase converts DHEA-S back into the DHEA form. So it takes the S off. It takes the sulfate off of estrone to make it estrone again. So it takes the S off of things and makes them biologically active. And so what happens is, when you have a gut microbiome that has high levels of STS, now you have DHEA and estrone and other sulfated hormones that are to be inactive. They get reactivated and they get recirculated. And so this is being shown in research, but unfortunately it's not being shown. They're not testing for STS in conventional, or that too, functional stool testing companies. But it's something to keep in mind as well, that the microbiome not only affects beta-glucuronidase, but STS. And then it also will affect hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase, HSD. So HSD is what you can see the conversions there. So 3-beta HSD increases your progesterone, your androstenol, your testosterone, your allo form of progesterone. And the 17-beta is what makes your androstenediol, your androstenedione, and your estradiol. So an estrobolome high in HSD can now have you have more of these hormones recirculated or reabsorbed to be recirculated. So testosterone, of course, being a big one, estradiol being another, really big one. And so it just goes to show more that when your microbiome is upset, now you are unbalanced. Now you have beta-glucuronidase levels probably too high, STS levels probably too high, HSD levels probably too high, and it's affecting your hormones. So always keep gut in mind when looking at hormones. Because what we want to do is this pathway. We want the ovary to make the hormone, and then it gets used in the body, goes to the liver, through the gut. Most of it gets excreted out in the feces and some comes back in. But what happens in an unhealthy microbiome is that most gets absorbed back into the body and very little goes out as estrogen in this example out of the body. So we're trying to be the analogy in the top half and not in the bottom half. We want a healthy microbiome. So how do you create a healthy estrobolome? Well, of course, doing functional stool testing. Check the levels, see if there's bacteria and critters and crawlers that shouldn't be down there. Check the beta-glucuronidase levels. Check the good gut microbiome microbiota levels in stool testing. And if you've never done stool testing before, I strongly suggest you poop in a cup for science, because it's the best way that you learn, and you'll learn on yourself. So treatment consideration number 1, focus on the diet, of course. It's now understood that diet plays a significant role in shaping the microbiome. Experiments showing that dietary alterations can induce large temporary microbial shifts in 24 hours. So that fast food that you ate yesterday totally affected you today. Your microbiome looks different today than it did yesterday. Whatever you ate today that you probably shouldn't have, it's going to affect your microbiome tomorrow, within 24 hours. So keep that in mind. Variability in gut microbial diversity means we need to have variability in our foods. We need the colorful foods. We need to eat the rainbow, because what we're trying to do is get a good balance in our beta-glucuronidase so that we can keep our good balance in our estrogens. Be very conscious, of course, on sugar, processed food, what we call the, quote, standard American diet, alcohol, toxicants, and antibiotics. So all these things will greatly increase beta-glucuronidase levels, and of course just affect your microbiome in general. We're focusing on beta-glucuronidase, but it does so much else. So speaking of antibiotics, we know antibiotics and toxicant exposure can greatly affect, your microbiome. This is a no-brainer. We all know this. But, when it comes to estrogen dominance and estrogen cancer-related risk, just work to get the microbiome back. Work to help. If somebody needs antibiotics, which is fine, then, work to repair the gut afterwards, because we want to reduce that risk of estrogen-related symptoms and cancer. And if you just do a quick search on toxicant exposure and its effect on hormones, on the gut microbiome, on the endocrine system, they're called endocrine disrupting chemicals for a reason. And our poor little endocrine system does not need to be disrupted any more than it already is. So talk with your patients about, again, what do they use? What are they drinking out of? Do they filter their water in their shower? Do they use the air fresheners in their home, in their car? What do they put on their skin and in their makeup and clean their house with and use on their yard? And what do they do for hobbies? And just really work to educate your patients that if they're having a lot of endocrine symptomatology, that it absolutely can be, toxicant affected. So eliminate or reduce alcohol. Why? Well, primarily, a good reason, of course, is SIBO. So moderate alcohol consumption is associated with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And what will SIBO do? Well, it affects our microbiome. So alcohol could affect that. But also, it is a no-brainer. We all know that alcohol affects estrogen. Why? Because it goes down the same CYP pathways, and alcohol wins. It will push estrogen out of the way, so to speak. So if you're somebody who is routinely drinking alcohol, no matter what, and you have estrogen issues, keep that in mind. And we know alcohol in men, women too, but primarily in men, we see this, increases aromatization. So all that, alcohol, beer, it's affecting your testosterone to estrogen conversion. It's increasing it. So be cognizant of your alcohol. And in this study, they found that a subgroup of alcoholics, they had altered colonic microbiome. And even if they stopped drinking, completely stopped drinking, the alteration the alteration for the worse was seen even in an extended period of sobriety. And so you might have to do a lot of work with people who have a current or past history of alcoholism on repairing their gut. And thankfully, as functional health practitioners, we're all really pretty skilled at that. We're all pretty prepared for that. So just keep that in mind and ask about, current and past alcohol use. Pre and probiotics and fermented foods. We know we're talking about repairing the gut, and these are huge things. Artichoke, dandelion greens, chicory root, partially hydrolyzed guar gum, pectin, just as some examples with some studies behind them, can really help with, with the microbiome. And then we have probiotics. So the prior slide was, the pre and the fibers. And what I don't have listed in this prior slide was the unpeeled carrots. Unpeeled carrots can fit in this category as well, that Apiaceae family. So unpeeled carrots can go here. And then we go on to calcium D-glucarate. So people say, well, okay, pre and probiotics, got it. What about other supplements? So calcium D-glucarate. Calcium D-glucarate is a beta-glucuronidase inhibitor. So it's known as a couple other things. Please don't confuse it with calcium. Calcium D-glucarate acts differently than calcium does. And what it does is it basically keeps the bow on the box and keeps estrogen inside. So the fancy mechanism of action is that it keeps the glucuronide group on the hydrophobic molecule for excretion. So, which is much easier to say. It keeps estrogen in the box and keeps the bow on tight. That's what calcium D-glucarate does. Does it lower beta-glucuronidase levels? No. You still have to do the work on those the microbiome, on the estrobolome. You still have to do the work on the diet, on the repair of the gut, on the pre and probiotics, on doing the stool testing. You still have to do that work. But in the meantime, calcium D-glucarate can be very helpful. Now, dosing is extremely high, 1,500 to 3,000 milligrams a day at a minimum, and in some animal studies it was much higher based on milligram of kilogram for body weight. But what they found was every little bit helped. So even animals who were taking a very small dose noticed a small decrease in circulating estrogen, and that it did affect the estrogen coming out of the feces. But if you're looking for actual, therapeutic, you are going to have to go pretty high. And especially, keep in mind your patient's weight as well. So 1,500 might be more for a maybe thinner or normal body weight, 3,000 if the person has more adipose tissue on them and is very, very estrogen dominant. Foods high in calcium D-glucarate. Unfortunately, not anywhere near therapeutic doses, and it might be in my resources, but I got this from a study where they looked at, they fed rats a CDG heavy diet, and in just diet alone, it affected their estrogen levels. And so foods and calcium D-glucarate, oranges, carrots, there's those carrots again, apples, grapefruit, and cruciferous vegetables. So you really can't go wrong eating raw unpeeled carrots, and you really can't go wrong eating cruciferous vegetables. You will help almost all your phases of estrogen detoxification. So, but you can use the supplement calcium D-glucarate. So let's summarize as we finish up this lecture when it comes to the phase 1, the phase 2, and the phase 3 detoxification. So number 1, focus on the liver and the microbiome for clearing estrogens. So we know phase 1 and phase 2 happen in the liver. Phase 3, when it comes to glucuronidation, beta-glucuronidase happens in the stool. So it's different areas, but all affect estrogen clearance. When it comes to the liver, the creation of unstable adducts is actually the real problem. And so you're trying to prevent or minimize cancer, estrogen-based cancers, work on all those things that help reduce unstable adducts. Again, remember, those are the wild childs. Those are the ones that are breaking off out of the DNA, leaving holes and running away. And now you have holes left over that your repair system has to work to repair. A few holes, not a big deal. A lot of holes increases the risk. If you don't test estrogen metabolism, then you won't know where the problem lies. So definitely, do Dutch testing, which of course is the point of this webinar. But if you just do DIM and they have a phase 2 problem, then you're not going to, it's helpful for nerve 2, but not so much COMT. Whereas if you have a phase 2 problem, a phase 1 problem, and you just keep giving them magnesium or SAM or, methionine or trimethylglycine, and you can't figure out why it's not getting better, then you have to test. And maybe the person is a phase 1 and a phase 2 problem person, and you have to do both. You need phase 1 and phase 2 to help get them from the proper water in their clawfoot bathtub and to open their drain appropriately. And then genomically, you want to look at COMT, you want to look at quinone reductase, which I put as QR, but actually it's NQ01 is the proper what you're looking for, especially in the literature. So COMT, quinone reductase, which is NQO1, and glutathione sulfur-transferase gene, which are the enzymes that help with proper excretion. Don't forget about your transporters. They're the good guys and girls that are helping you get from your water state into across a fatty lipid or a fatty membrane, lipophilic membrane, and out. So please give some love to your transporters, reduce inflammation, upregulate NRF2. Unhealthy bile and an unbalanced microbiome will raise your hormone levels. So as that study showed, women injected with radioactive or radio-labeled estrogens, most of it went back in the body and very little came out in the feces. Do stool and SIBO testing for further evaluation. You want to see what's going on down in the gut. Know that you are what you eat and absorb. So if you've got estrogen issues, definitely eat for your liver and for your microbiome. And of course, if you have to drink alcohol, apparently Cabernet Franc is where it's at because you will get the most resveratrol, and then that will upregulate your NRF2. That will help with your quinone reductase, and that will help with your estrogen detoxification. So if you have to drink, go for Cabernet Franc. So there was a question that I wanted to answer, though. Does high gut beta-glucuronidase correlate with high urinary excretion of beta-glucuronidase? Which is a very good question. So all the beta-glucuronidase, when I do beta-glucuronidase testing, I do stool testing. So I do, which is what all the literature, the research that I look at does as well. So for those of you who are curious, does beta-glucuronidase show up in the urine? You should be doing it in the stool. So this is why I'm saying definitely poop in a cup for science. If you haven't yet, you've got your own best practice, your own best patient. That's where you learn the best. So do your dried urine testing, find out your phase 1 and phase 2, do your stool testing, find out what your phase 3 is doing, and now you have all of the ways to help maximize and your benefits and reduce your risk for estrogen dominant symptoms and estrogen cancers. So if it wasn't listed in my slides and you're looking for the resource, I probably have it listed here, but I tried to list as much as I could on each slide. And that concludes our talk. So thank you so much for listening. I greatly appreciate all of your time, and I hope you now feel like you are an expert on phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 detoxification for estrogen. I am Dr. Carrie Jones with the Dutch test.